Well, thank you once again for joining us. Welcome to Grace. As we move forward today in our journey through the Bible, there are a couple more things I'd like to point out in the book of Numbers before we move on to the book of Joshua, which will definitely be our next lesson. We'll begin today's message with a return to the map that I've entitled Israel's 40-Year Journey. Take a close look at this map because it'll help you as we figure our way or walk our way with Israel through that wilderness education they had to where they're headed, and that's their land. In our previous session, we noted how Moses asked the king of Edom, now locate Edom on the map, the king of Edom is located toward the upper right side of the map, if the Israelites could pass through his territory on their way to Canaan, and how the king's response was an unqualified no. Now remember, Esau was Jacob's twin brother, and so the king of Edom, there's a heritage here. As the king of Edom comes down the line, Esau was called Edom, so we know the Edomites were descendants of Esau. But in spite of that family connection that had existed through Esau centuries earlier, Esau, again, Isaac's twin brother, the king of Edom wanted no part of the people of Israel. So Moses turned his focus away from the territory where the king of Edom dwelt and headed south toward the Red Sea. If you're looking at your map, you can see that the Red Sea is south of Edom. Stopping at Mount Or, where Aaron died and where the mantle of the high priesthood was passed on to Eleazar. So focus on the map and follow their journey with me. After mourning for Aaron for 30 days at Mount Hor, the Israelites journeyed southward toward Mount Seir, and then on to the place known as Etzion Geber, from whence they journeyed on eastward and then back again northward. You can see there on the map, skirting Edom to the east and coming to the outside edge of the territory of Moab. Now these locations look very close on the map. They're farther away in real life, but it's brought up close so you can get an idea of where they were. By bypassing Edom proper, they could make their way toward the Jordan River, and we would know they would cross the Jordan and come to Jericho and enter the land of Canaan. It was from Israel's encampment in that outlying territory of Moab that God gave Israel the victory over the Amorites. You can see them approaching the Amorites there, the territory of the Amorites, between Ammon and Moab. And God gave them the victory over the Amorites. Not Ammonites, but Amorites, two different groups. After which, the children of Israel took up residence in the Amorite cities, all that central part between Edom and Moab. The children of Israel were scattered out there, and they were taking up residence there. It's easy to see how with Israel taking up residence in the territory between Moab and Ammon, and with the sheer number of those Israelites, more than 1 million, some say 2.5 million, even upwards, the king of the Moabites began to feel a little bit more than uncomfortable. We concluded our previous session with the story of Balak and Balaam in Numbers chapters 21 through 24. You'll recall how Balak, king of Moab, was distressed because of the vast company of Israelites and his fear that those Israelites would take over his territory. He knew how Israel had defeated the Amorites, and Balak did not want that to happen to him. So Balak sent word to the elders of Midian. Now the Midianites were down south there. You can see that to the left side of Mount Sinai. That whole entire territory was taken up with the Midianites. And so Balak inquired of the Midianites, he knew there was a prophet there, as to whether he might employ Balaam, who was a prophet, to curse Israel. So we're going to get Balaam, a prophet, to come up and curse the nation. This is where we found out that Balaam was a prophet for hire. He was not God's man by any stretch of the imagination. Balaam wasn't on God's team by any means. He was playing for the opposite team. Balak made several attempts to get that cursing of Israel accomplished, but not once would the Lord allow Balaam, Balak's hired prophet, to carry that cursing out. On Balaam's final attempt to curse Israel in return for a handsome profit, a handsome reward from Balak, the angel of the Lord stood in the path of Balaam's donkey. Now you remember that story, blocking the donkey's way. And this is where the donkey fell on his foot. Balaam struck his donkey, and what happened? The donkey spoke to Balaam, and God got Balaam's attention. So Numbers chapter 24 concludes with Balaam returning to Midian and Balak, the get-them-cursed king, returning to his place of residence in Moab. Now, even though God would not allow Balaam to curse Israel outright, don't think that Satan wasn't finished in his attempt to do away with the usefulness of the nation God planned to use in his repossession of the earthly realm. Numbers chapter 25 opens with Israel's next place of encampment. This is where Israel's report card for obedience under that law contract was in such negative standing that 24,000 of those Israelites died in a plague brought on as a result of their utter disregard of God's words to Moses when the Ten Commandments were handed down on that second plate of stones. Let's go back and look at God's commandment to Israel in Exodus chapter 23, beginning with verse 31. And we'll see what transgression was committed by the Israelites at that time. This issue is going to be the issue on Israel's table as we enter Numbers chapter 25. Concerning the nations that were around them, the nations God knew that Israel would be encountering, the law contained this directive to the people of God's nation. Exodus chapter 23, beginning with verse 32. Thou shalt make no covenant with them. Who's it speaking of here? Well, the other nations. Thou shalt make no covenant with them, nor with their gods. They shall not dwell in thy land, lest they make thee sin against me. For if thou serve their gods, it will surely be a snare unto thee. That's putting it mildly, but that's putting it in the law. And so Israel was to have nothing to do with the nations around them, because those nations would lead them to their gods, their false gods. We see God's same instruction to the nation, to Israel, issued in the second giving of the law, Deuteronomy chapter 7, verses 3 and 4. Now, we're not spending a lot of time in Deuteronomy. Just understand it's the second giving of the law. And here in Deuteronomy, God forbade the intermarrying of the Israelites with those outside their nation. Notice God's directive in these verses, Deuteronomy chapter 7, beginning with verse 3. Neither shalt thou make marriages with them. Thy daughter thou shalt not give unto his son. Don't give your daughters away to marry those guys. Nor his daughter shalt thou take unto thy son. For they will turn away thy son from following me, that they may serve other gods. So will the anger of the Lord be kindled against you, and destroy thee. Next word. Suddenly. This is pretty serious business here, this intermarrying, this prohibition against intermarriage. Intermarriages between the Israelites and the nations or the Gentiles was strictly forbidden under that Mosaic law. Was it this prohibition against intermarriages an issue of skin color? Of course not. Everybody knows that. The answer is no. I bring this up at this point in our study because the passage we'll be considering as we enter chapter 25 in Numbers is sometime construed to lead in that direction, that misconception. God tells us the reason why he put this non-intermarriage prohibition, non-marriage outside the nation in place for Israel. And surprising as it is to some, it had nothing whatsoever to do with the color of the person's skin. Rather, it had to do with serving gods other than him. It's not a Ham issue, as some people want to believe. That's the whole issue. No, it's serving gods that were other than the Most High God. It was an issue of Gentile spouses turning their Israeli marriage partners away from the Most High God and leading them to worship the gods the Gentiles had manufactured for themselves. False gods. Some have used this passage in Numbers as a validation of their view that God forbids interracial marriage. I'll show you how that comes about in just a few minutes. But what about interracial marriage today? Now, this is a topic some are interested in. Not as much so in our generation as it was in generations past, but still it's a topic to many. Does God condone interracial marriage? Does he prohibit interracial marriage? Is that an interesting topic? The answer might not be what you expect. Would it surprise you to know that there's no such thing as interracial marriage? Does that throw you for a loop? If all human beings have descended from Adam and Eve, if we all share those common parents, then there's only one biological race on the planet Earth. Not 2, 3, not 4 more. There's only one biological race on planet Earth. It's true that there are varying shades of skin color within the single human race. those shades ranging from pale white all the way to black, but all skin colors exist within a single race, the race called the human. Simple enough, isn't it? Then where did the idea of different races come from? Well, it came from those varying shades of skin color within the single human race, the varying shades of skin color associated with the different ethnic groups originating in different areas of the globe as a result of the flood of Noah's day. Of course, the theory of evolution, held by many in our day, continues to foster not only the idea of different races, but also, in this pastor's opinion, the racism that's still very prevalent in our day. Don't misunderstand. I didn't say that the theory of evolution created racism. Sin is what brought racism about. I said that I believe that the theory of evolution, held by many, fosters the racism that exists across the globe. Doesn't do anything to negate it. It helps enhance that idea. Don't think that religianity hasn't had its own part to play in the racism that exists across the world. Darwin talked about different races of people and the fact that all races of people have descended from a common ape-like creature. The slide on the screen is a depiction of Darwinistic, I should say, evolution of skull shapes. If Darwin's theory is correct, and evolution has brought the different races about, these people groups evolving separately and all from that common ape-like creature, then you can see how the evolutionary concept can lead to the belief that some groups are more primitive in their evolutionary progress than other groups. That there are lower forms and higher forms, lower races and higher races of people. Now tie that thought line to the sin nature of man. And can you see how that idea of evolution rather than creationism has fostered racism? Was the thinking that different groups are at allegedly different stages of evolution, and so people groups are more backward. Some people groups are more backward than other people groups, making some people groups not as fully human as other people groups. Was that type of thinking maybe or perhaps working in the mind of Hitler in his quest to eliminate Jews and gypsies and establish the master race? You see where a lot of this comes from, folks? And it just continues on. Sadly, many who profess Christianity today, whatever that means in our day, have been infected by that evolutionary indoctrination. I used infected, not affected, infected. That people of different color are inferior because they are lower on the evolutionary chain. Now, it doesn't go across the board, though. The human mind, the way it works along with that sin nature, to say people of a starkly different color, that's where we've got to be concerned, because those people might be the lowest on the chain of evolution. And that underlying thought with that evolutionary idea that everybody came from a common ancestor, an ape-like creature, has fostered the racism we have today. Such attitudes are totally unbiblical, I think you know. And when those attitudes are working in the minds of Christians, quote unquote, you can see how out of context Bible verses taken out of context, are often conscripted in an attempt to justify racist viewpoints. If the Bible history is correct, and we believe that it is, then all of humankind has descended from one man and one woman, that being Adam and Eve. God gave to his human creation the divine stewardship over how much on this planet? Over the entire living creation. Then according to Scripture, animal creation, according to Scripture, God brought the animal creation unto Adam to see what Adam would call them. Adam was given that responsibility. Name this whole entire animal creation, Adam. And God knew that Adam was capable of doing so. He wasn't the dummy on the block. Adam knew what he was doing. It wasn't from the puddle to paradise. It was, in a sense, from paradise to the puddle, in a manner of speaking. Whatsoever Adam called every living creature was the name that creature had from that point on. And that was by God's decree, his design. So Adam was no dummy, as we said. Adam wasn't on the lowest rung of some evolutionary caveman process whereby he brought about humankind as we know it today. And look at us, aren't we prize packages of humanity? That isn't the case. Adam was not the lowest member on the rung of the human race of evolution, as we're given to believe. Now, if all human beings are descended from the same man and that same woman, not an ape man and an ape woman who just made grunts at each other as they moved around, then how many races are there when it comes to the people of the world? Well, there's only one race called the human race. Again, I believe that the evolutionary school of thought fuels racism. But don't think for a moment, as I said, that the theory of evolution is the only fuel for the fire of bigoted thinking. Misguided, misinformed religianity has had its own role to play. Where do many who profess Christianity come to the notion that God wants all the varying shades of people, especially the groups who are most starkly different in color from others, to marry only people who are exactly skin-shaded like them? Well, the answer oftentimes comes from a failure to understand where skin color comes from in the first place, and why God forbade the Israelites to marry outside their own people group. The reasoning goes like this. Israel was not to mix marriage-wise, pretty evident in the verses we read earlier, outside their own people. We know that. They were to pick their spouses only from among their own people group. Now, if we've become spiritual Israel, as many are wont to believe today because many preachers are promoting that notion, then why not spiritualize the prohibition? You see what's happening? God does not want us to mix marriage-wise apart from our own people group, and color is something that sets people groups apart, is it not? So do you see where the idea comes from? Do you know what that is? That's nothing more than spiritualizing a portion of Scripture in order to feed and validate man's prideful sin nature and the degree of importance we attach to self and those like self. The question is, why again did God forbid the marriages of the Israelites with those outside their own nation? He tells us. He doesn't leave us guessing. The answer is a simple one. And it has nothing to do with the color of the person's skin. By the time God chose one man, Abram, out from among the nations, in order to form that one nation that God would use in his plan to repossess the earthly realm, God had already given up on the Gentiles, the nations of the earth. Gentiles, nations, same word. And he'd given them over to their reprobate thinking. God gave them up, the Bible tells us. Now, let's quickly revisit those verses in Romans chapter 1, beginning with verse 22. And we'll find out why God did not want the Israelites to marry apart from their own people. Many of you are very familiar with these passages, but it doesn't hurt us to look these up once again. Romans chapter 1, beginning with verse 22. The Gentiles, professing themselves to be wise, totally different than we would be today, right? Professing themselves to be wise, they, the nations of the earth, became fools and changed the glory of the uncorruptible God into an image made like corruptible man, and to the birds and four-footed beasts and creeping things. What were they doing, these nations, these Gentiles? Well, they were worshiping the creation rather than the Creator. What was the result of their turning away from God to focus on gods of their own making? The answer sits in the remainder of the passage. Verse 24 continues, wherefore God also gave them up to uncleanness through the lusts of their own hearts, to dishonor their own bodies between themselves, the Gentiles. It's pretty clear to me, who changed the truth of God into a lie. And here it is, worshiped and served the creature more than the Creator, who is blessed forever. Amen. Of course, that creature today mainly is self. We worship self above everything else we worship. But of course, you can see how when it came to false gods, they were worshiping creatures of their own making, of their own design. What was the result, once again, of the Gentiles worshiping gods of their own making? Whether those be gods, whether the Gentiles were serving the images they themselves had designed from creation, or whether they were worshiping facets of creation itself that God designed. Here it is in verse 26, the result. For this cause God, next three words, gave them up unto vile affections, for even their women did change the natural use of the woman into that which is against nature. And we don't it doesn't take much imagination to discover what was going on. God didn't say as dispensations move and as time progresses, things will change and I'll just feel differently about some things. He's never felt differently about this. Now, don't come to the mistaken conclusion that giving the Gentiles up, as our verse just read, is the same thing as God giving up on the Gentiles. That's something else. That would be another thing altogether, and that was not about to happen. To give them up meant that God simply allowed the Gentiles to continue to follow that anti-God track that they were on. God knew they weren't about to change their minds. It wasn't that God had given up on them. It was that they had given up on him. So he gave them up to the thinking that was theirs all along, as verse 28 reveals. And even as God, is that the next word? Even as they did not like to retain God in their knowledge, God gave them over to a reprobate mind. Okay, go your own way. Do your own thing. I'm going to let you alone then, and you can just stay in that track you're already on to do those things which are not convenient. Again, God didn't give up on them. They gave up on him. And God simply said, so be it. Now, God then formed a special nation out of the nations. He called out Abram, and by way of that he would accomplish in connection with that special nation, by way of that which he would bring about in connection with that special nation, he would reach the nations who were on that wrong track. That was God's plan. So don't think that God giving them up meant that God had given up on them. God always had the nations or the Gentiles in mind. He just chose to reach those Gentiles through the nation Israel. But again, don't lose sight of why God gave the Gentiles up in the first place. It was because of their worship, their adoration, their respect, their devotion, their veneration of those things that occupied their time and their minds, those things that they placed on high, rather than worship the Most High God. Revelation chapter 4, verse 11 comes to mind here. Thou art worthy, O Lord. Thou alone art worthy is the idea there. Why? Because the word thou is in the emphatic position in Scripture. In the emphatic position, the word that appears first shows you the importance of what the writer was trying to get across. Thou alone art worthy, O Lord, art worthy to receive glory and honor and power. For thou hast created all things, and for thy pleasure they are and were created. So it was an extremely serious thing. It was actually a transgression of the law contract for those under the law, for man to have gods of man's design rather than to honor the God who had designed man. This is the reason why God forbade the intermarrying of the Israelites with the Gentiles. The Gentiles were refusing to worship the Most High God. Therefore, the Israelites were not to become one flesh, not to intermingle marriage-wise, especially with those outside the nation God formed, because God knew that those outside the nation that he was forming, those outside that nation, the nations would lead his nation to worship the gods those nations had formed for themselves. It was about worship. It was a worship issue. It was about honoring the Most High God, and the nations were honoring gods of their own design. Okay, it was never about the shade of their skin. It was always about the tendency Israel would have to move away from him. The shade of their skin, nothing whatsoever to do with the prohibition against intermarrying with other groups with heritage from other parts of the globe. Different groups were formed when God scattered the people by confounding the common language at the Tower of Babel. But again, the purpose for that scattering was not about keeping certain people groups away from other people groups, but about replenishing the earth as he had told them to do, and they had refused to do. Now, I'll force you to do that. I'll confound the common language, and you want to hang around with people who can talk like you. But people of different ethnic groups and different skin colors talk like us. Isn't that amazing? How we're learning languages today. But it was an issue of replenishing the earth, and the Gentiles back then refused to scatter out and do that. I realize that the word race has come to signify differing ethnic groups from different parts of the globe, for sure. But and that means different shades of people. But the important thing, from God's perspective, has always been about a common belief concerning him. It's never been about a common color of a person's skin. We shouldn't marry a person of a different belief. especially where the crosswork of Christ is concerned, even if we share the exact sameness when it comes to tint and tone of our skin. We should never marry outside of the belief that we have. And of course, that concerns the accomplishment of Christ when he died on the cross, taking our sins away. So we should share that like-minded belief. The justice-resolving accomplishment of the crosswork of Christ, who bore our sins to satisfy God's justice. So that should be a common belief we all share. Not to belabor the point, but think about the skin tone of the Israelites for a moment. Let's go back to that. That's surprising to a lot of folks. For that matter, think about the shade of Christ's skin. Christ was born under the law, was he not? And Christ was born in Bethlehem, which we all know is in the Middle East. Christ was a Semite as far as people groups were concerned. What would have been the color of Christ's skin? Would Christ have looked like many of the portrait depictions of Christ today, hanging in living rooms across the country? Let me show you some of those depictions, by the way. Here's one example of Christ as he was depicted in the 11th century. Anyone watching our lesson today have this picture hanging in your living room? I thought not. I'd been surprised if somebody shook their head yes. How about this depiction of Jesus Christ from the 12th century? We're moving up a century here from the 11th to the 12th. Anyone have this one hanging in your foyer? Here's another from the 13th century, and I think you can see how different cultures have depicted Christ in different ways and at different times. We're going from the 11th to the 12th and now to the 13th. Just a bit different, is it not? I don't know how many of you have that hanging from your, maybe from your mirror in your automobile. It would make a good sun catcher, wouldn't it, if it was stained glass, but whatever. Christ took on more human-looking form in this Macedonian depiction from the 14th century as we move forward. The skin tone in this picture would have been much more accurate, at least the tone of the skin. But we don't have that one hanging in our living rooms either, do we? And then in the 16th century, as we jump a couple and move forward, Christ's form began to change a bit more. However, he was still white to white folks, as you'll be able to see here in the 16th century portrayal. Now, this looks a little more like the way he's often depicted today, does it not? But this was 16th century. We're moving ahead now. We're really making some progress. When we move ahead to the earlier part of the 20th century, we have a picture that was prevalent in homes across the country when I was raised, when I was coming up. Most of you have seen this picture. Who's not familiar with this rendition? Christ had fair skin, blue eyes, long brown flowing locks coming down across his shoulders in this famous painting. You wouldn't be able to number or care to number the homes with this picture in a prominent position on a table or on a wall, even as we speak. This is a very common and widely accepted portrayal of Christ. Of course, as times change, so do the depictions of Christ. How many of you have this one hanging on your living room wall? Did it change? It didn't change, did it? You don't have that one up there, do you? Or even this one, obviously from a television or a movie characterization of Christ. See how things change? The interesting thing is that in every culture and down through the course of time, artists have offered renderings of Christ in a way that the people of the time and in their area wanted to think of him, in a way that the people in that area prefer to relate to him. The white folks think of him as being white, while many of the black folks think of him as being black. How would Jesus have actually looked during the days of his humiliation on the earth? Well, some of you may recall the study conducted by the researchers of a magazine called Popular Mechanics some years ago. I think it was 2002. The article I'm talking about appeared in the December 7th, 2002 edition of Popular Mechanics. Researchers associated with Popular Mechanics, they either hired them, knew them, they were sponsored, definitely, these researchers, by the magazine. Those researchers took many things into consideration. They considered the time period in which Christ walked the earth. They considered the area of the globe where he lived, where he was born, where he ministered, and how those of that area and his ethnicity would have looked in that day. And this is what they arrived at from a general appearance perspective. Anyone have that one hanging in your living room? Now, I don't know how they came up with the trimmed beard or the perplexed stare. But the research team deduced that he would have looked like the typical Galilean Semite of the era in the area. Did they get it correct? Well, not exactly. How do we know they didn't get it correct? The Apostle Paul, who lived during the time period when Christ was ministering on the earth, said in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 14, and we don't need to put that slide on the screen, doth not even nature itself teach you that if a man have long hair, it's a shame to him? So based on Paul's statement, the researchers deduced that Christ would most likely not have had long hair, as he is most often depicted in pictures today. So that part they did get correct. Jesus worked outdoors as a carpenter, and traveling outside as Jesus did would perhaps point to a face that was probably weather-beaten, making Jesus appear much older than his years, according to the research team. Their depiction doesn't necessarily show that. He would also, well, maybe he was 14 there, I don't know, but he would also most likely have had dark eyes, not the baby blues that we see in the pictures of the Western world. He would have looked a great deal more like a darker-skinned Semite than the portraits presented of him in our area of the globe, the Western world. His hair would have been dark and curly, very curly, or perhaps even kinky, as we would say, rather than the long and smoothly flowing blonde locks we see in artist renditions in our day. One thing we know for sure, Jesus Christ was not a handsome man. According to the prophet Isaiah, who depicted him for us, as Isaiah was prompted to depict him by the Holy Spirit's inspiration. Notice Isaiah's words in the latter half of Isaiah chapter 53, beginning with verse 2. Isaiah said there, he hath no form. Now the Hebrew word translated form means favored or goodly. He does not have a goodly structure, nor comeliness, meaning splendor or grandeur in a sense of opulence. And when we shall see him, there is how much beauty? Oh, not we can get by with this guy. No beauty. Beauty defines as goodly to look upon. No beauty. That tells us that Christ was not a handsome man, that we should even desire him. In other words, there was nothing about Jesus Christ as he ministered on the earth from the standpoint of physical stature, physical appearance, that would lend themselves to attracting people to him, to attracting anyone to him. In fact, his appearance may have turned the pretty people away from him. Isn't that interesting? The people concerned with impression through appearance wouldn't want having to do with him. They wouldn't want anybody else to know they were associated with him. It was the words he spoke that drew people to listen to what Christ had to say, not the way he looked. What has led us around the mulberry bush, or me anyway, around the mulberry bush in a manner of speaking, when it comes to the book of Numbers? Well, it's the fact that the Israelites were not to marry outside of their own people group, outside the nation. They were to pick their spouses only from among their own people. But that prohibition had nothing whatsoever to do with appearance, whether it be beauty, color of eyes, color of skin. It had only to do with common belief in him and what he'd revealed about himself to that point in time. As indicated earlier, Christ would have most likely had dark eyes and been dark complexioned, not white, not black, but as it's called, swarthy, or dark brown and leathery complected, like the people in his area. The only reason the Israelites were not to marry outside of their own nation was the fact that God knew that the hearts of those oppositionites, as I like to call them, would not be inclined toward him. They hadn't been when he gave up on those Gentiles, but would instead be inclined in the opposite direction. And I said gave up on those Gentiles. I hope you've caught that. Gave them up, not gave up on them. He never gave up on them. The Gentiles were inclined to serve the false gods of their own making rather than the God of creation. So Israel was God's covenant nation, his covenant people. The Gentiles were not under that covenant. They were not God's covenant people. The Lord knew that marriages between Israelites and those of the Gentile nations would lead the Israelite spouses who chose to go that route away from the God they were supposed to be worshiping rather than toward him, away from the worship of him and toward the worship of the false gods these oppositionites had designed for themselves and were serving. This was why marriages without those outside the nation of Israel were strictly forbidden. God has revealed to us the reason for the prohibition against marrying in other ethnic groups, and now we know what that was for Israel. This brings us right back to the book of Numbers, folks, and the failure of many in that nation when it came to that outside marriage prohibition, as they were sitting right on the edge of their promised land. They'd been journeying some 40 years, and they're right at the door of their promised land, and watch what they're doing here. God is presenting proof here in the book of Numbers, and at this point, that the nation had not learned the lesson of his name, much less had they come to call upon him, call upon his name, and to trust in what that name meant. He is, in essence, allowing us to see their report card and evaluate their progress in the education he was putting them through there in the wilderness. Right on the heels of the false prophet Balaam returning to his homeland, and King Balak returning to Moab to close out chapter 24 of Numbers, we see these words appear in the very next verse, the very next chapter, chapter 25. Notice what was happening with the children of Israel in verse 1. And Israel abode in Shittim, and the people began to commit whoredom with the daughters of Moab. And they, the daughters of Moab, called the people, their Israelite partners, unto the sacrifice of the Moabite gods. And the people, Israelite men, did eat and bowed down to their gods. First of all, where was Shittim? Well, let's take a moment to locate Shittim on the Israel 40-year journey map once again. Shittim, also known as Abel Shittim, is located about 10 miles northeast of the Dead Sea. You see it clear up at the top. It's in white letters just to the left of Joshua, the book of Joshua depiction there. It's very small letters, but that's where it is. Otherwise, that Dead Sea, otherwise known as the Salt Sea. You can see it at the very top, just above Ammon. Now, to the left of Abel Shittim, and just across the river Jordan is what? Jericho, where Israel will be headed when they leave Shittim. It was from Abel Shittim, and by the way, we know people that will be going on this next cruise we take who go every year, and they're digging in that area. They're right, I don't know if they're doing it right this minute, but they dig in that area, and interesting thing, they say they pretty convincing proof that was Sodom. That's the area of Sodom. But anyway, Israel's right on the edge of their land, and as soon as they leave Shittim, Abel Shittim, they're going to cross that river and go into Jordan. It was from Abel Shittim that Israel would proceed to the river Jordan and enter Canaan. Now, what transgression, again, did many of the Israelite men commit? The answer is fornication with the Moabite women. Verse 1 tells us that they were committing whoredom with the daughters of Moab. This was a most flagrant transgression, as we've already seen. God had strictly forbade this type of behavior in the law contract and warned Israel in the second giving of the law about the serious consequences that would follow should Israel be guilty of such activity. Do you remember Deuteronomy chapter 7, verses 3 and 4, a passage we looked at earlier? Neither shalt thou make marriages with them. Thy daughter shall not give, thou shalt not give unto his son, nor his daughter shalt thou take unto thy son, for they will turn away the son from following me, that they may serve the other gods. So will the anger of the Lord be kindled against you and destroy thee suddenly. So, did God make a promise he would destroy them? Is God going to destroy them? Does he keep his word? Yes, but he's not destroying innocent little cherubs running around that want God. The destruction is going to come from those who adamantly oppose the Most High God and would lead Israel in doing the same. This was all part of Satan's plan, folks, to pervert God's nation by having the Moabite women seduce the Israelite men, thereby rendering the nation useless to God in his plan to repossess the earthly realm. When Balaam tried to curse Israel for Balak, we were told that God put a word in his mouth. It wasn't what Balaam wanted to speak. God put a word in his mouth. God caused Balaam to bless Israel rather than to curse Israel. The fact that Balaam wanted to curse them because Balaam wanted the wealth that cursing would bring his way is found over in the book of the Revelation. So sometimes you have to join these passages to get more of the detail. Where we see Balaam didn't go away quietly when God refused to allow him to curse God's people. Balaam didn't curse them. God didn't permit that. But Balaam did proceed to tell Balak how to seduce them. If God won't let me curse them, there's a better way. Let's get God himself to curse them. Here's how you do that. Pay your women. He was willing to pay Balak, was he not? Reward him handsomely. But now Balak could use his money to pay the Moabite women, young women especially, to seduce the Israeli men. And that way, Balaam wouldn't have to curse Israel. God would curse Israel. And that was the thing. Do you think Satan knew about Leviticus 26 and all the buckets of wrath that God promised would come down on them for disobedience? Do you think Balaam knew about that? Satan knew about it. So Satan knew that, let's get this cursing over with. Let's get it done. Let's empty those buckets and empty them right now. Let's get Israel cursed. So the goal for Balak and Balaam was to get God's people cursed, whatever that took. Revelation chapter 12, verse 14 gives us the rest of the story. Here it is. But I have a few things against thee, John writing to the church of Pergamos in this passage, because thou hast there them that hold the doctrine of Balaam, the prophet for hire, who taught Balak, now here it is, who taught Balak to cast a stumbling block before the children of Israel, to eat things sacrificed unto idols, and to commit fornication. So Balaam taught Balak how to get the cursing done, since Balaam couldn't do it. You can bet that Balak, who had previously offered to pay Balaam handsomely to curse the nation, was more than willing to spend whatever it took to get the young women of Moab, the women of his kingdom, to entice the Israelite men in order to corrupt the people God had Balaam bless. Balaam told Balak what to do. The prophet was no man of God, obviously. Many of the men in Israel took the bait, but they couldn't say that God hadn't warned them previously. There were serious consequences of such behavior. The hammer's about to fall as we come to verses 4 and 5 of Numbers chapter 25. And the Lord said unto Moses, take all the heads of the people. Now this is not their literal heads. Just twist their head till it pops off and then put it on a stake over here. Take all the heads of the people. Take their chieftains. Take the captains. Take the rulers of your nation who had committed that violation, and hang them up before the Lord against the sun. In other words, impale those men, hang them on a stake as an example before all the children of Israel. And do it in broad daylight in everybody's sight, that the contract that you guys signed for is a most serious thing, not to be trifled with or ignored as though God hadn't meant what he said. That the fierce anger of the Lord may be turned away from Israel. And Moses said unto the judges of Israel, slay ye every one of his men that were joined to Baal Peor. So we really don't know the appearance of Baal Peor, the false god of the Moabites and others of that region, but artists have rendered him in various ways. What we do know, and some of them are hideous, what we do know is that Israel had refused to learn the lesson. Their wilderness education was designed to teach them. Now, many in God's nation, those who were committing whoredom with the daughters of the Moabites, had begun worshiping Baal Peor along with the women who had enticed them to fornication in the first place, just as God had predicted would happen if they fell for the designs of the women outside the nation. The women were most likely being paid to lead the Israeli men away from the God of Israel and to the gods of the Moabites, but who really knows? Whether paid or not, the enticement of these women had worked. And the Israeli men were mixing with the Moabite women. Interestingly enough, we see no mention of the judges of Israel actually carrying out Moses' put them to death decree. It's not mentioned here. We can assume they followed Moses' instructions, but the text doesn't tell us that. We do know that God brought about a plague upon Israel due to their rebellion. We're told that altogether 24,000 people died in the plague that God brought that day, 23 of them dying in a single day. Destroying them suddenly was something God promised, and he was going to keep his word. Now, while some in the nation were mourning the deaths associated with that plague, and perhaps the deaths of the rulers who were hung because of their rebellion, we know while they were mourning, the plague was brought on. But while they were mourning the death of these rulers, and perhaps the death of the people in the plague, Watch what happens in the very next verse, verse 6 of Numbers 25. And behold, one of the children of Israel came and brought unto his brethren a Midianitish woman in the sight of Moses and in the sight of the whole congregation of the children of Israel. So he took this Midianite woman to his family, who were weeping before the door, the children of Israel, weeping before the door of the tabernacle of the congregation. What a flagrant violation of God's previous directions. A real slap in the face to the Most High God, who had exercised his name on Israel's behalf over and over again. The Israeli man was flaunting his foolhardiness before Moses and the entire congregation, apparently because he brought her unto his brethren. Apparently his family members were not the least bit averse to this man's perverse behavior. We see no mention in the passage where they called him out or dressed him down. Were they defending their son at any cost? Would any of that take place today? Nah. Were they defending their son? I believe they were. This is where Aaron's grandson, Phinehas, jumped into action, and he brought the plague upon the nation to a halt, a screeching halt. Verse 7 and 8 tell us what Phinehas did, the action he took. And when Phinehas, the son of Eleazar, the priest, the son of Aaron, the priest, saw it, he rose up among the congregation, took a javelin in his hand, and he went after the man of Israel who had committed that crime into the tent and thrust both of them through, the man of Israel and the woman, through her belly. So the plague was stayed. It was stopped from the children of Israel. It's not difficult to imagine what was taking place in that tent between that man and that woman when Phinehas entered that tent. The verse reads that Phinehas thrust both of them through with his javelin. Now the javelin was a very sharp spear that was designed to be thrust or thrown. You didn't stab with it as you would with perhaps a bayonet. You threw a javelin. This lends to the idea that it wasn't thrown twice, Phinehas having to go retrieve it and come back and take aim and then throw it again. It was thrown once, one casting of the javelin. And with that one casting of that sharp javelin, he killed both offenders at the same time. If the imaginable were indeed taking place in that tent, the Lord's judgment through Phinehas could very well have taken place with a single fling of that javelin. As a result of the heroic action of the grandson of the high priest Aaron, God stayed the plague that he brought upon the nation, as verse 10 and 11 indicate. And the Lord spake unto Moses, saying, Phinehas, the son of Eleazar, the son of Aaron the priest, hath turned my wrath away from the children of Israel, while he was zealous for my sake among them, that I consumed not the children of Israel in my jealousy. The statement, in my jealousy, is that not an interesting statement to make in connection with the Most High God? A little strange to think of God as being jealous. But this isn't the only occurrence of God being a jealous God in Scripture. No less than 10 times God refers to himself in his word as being a jealous God. Why does that sound a bit strange to our ears? Well, the answer is because when we think of the words jealousy, we think in terms of the negative thoughts and feelings of insecurity, fear, and anxiety over an anticipated loss of something or someone. Our idea of jealousy is that of an emotion encompassing feelings that range all the way from fear and abandonment to rage and humiliation. One encyclopedia describes jealousy as being a form of pride, in that jealous people feel that someone is treating them unfairly and abusing them. One sage expressed the human emotion of jealousy, keyword human, this way: in jealousy there's really more self-love than love. Isn't that interesting? Another said, it's not love that's blind, it's jealousy that's blind. Do either of those comments sound to you like the Most High God? Would the Most High God be an insecure God? A God driven by emotion rather than reason? We must be careful not to read the human sin nature idea of jealousy into the jealousy associated with the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. There's human jealousy, there's godly jealousy, a different thing. The first synonym listed for jealousy, the word jealousy in a thesaurus, is the word protectiveness. Watchfulness, concern for the sake and security of the one for whom this protectiveness is directed, is the idea behind the word jealous when that word applies to God. God was simply protecting his people, and his anger is mentioned in connection with his jealousy when he knew that Israel was doing something, or somebody was doing something to Israel, that would bring harm to his nation. The word jealous in connection with God had to do with the Lord's watch care over his earthly people, the nation Israel. The Lord knew that a little leaven leaveneth, how much? The whole lump, as Paul would later on say to those to whom he was writing during this dispensation of grace. Paul told the saints in Corinth that he was jealous over them with godly jealousy. This should tell us that there's a difference in jealousy as related to personal insecurity, jealousy that has the sin nature attached to it, and jealousy that has to do with the protection of a loved one from harm. The latter, godly jealousy, was true of God concerning the nation Israel. When it came to the children of Israel, God knew that the behavior of some in that nation would have not only an influential but a negative impact on the entire nation, as others in the nation would be led to follow in the footsteps of the idolatrous practitioners that were among them, thus causing harm to befall them all. So God's jealousy in connection with his nation had to do with Israel's security, not with some supposed insecurity in the Most High God. Israel's only security, folks, would come from calling upon and trusting in the capacity resident in God's name and nothing else. They could do nothing for anyone. Those gods, they were false gods, could do nothing for anyone. These stories appear where they do in Scripture as proof of the failure of the nation during their wilderness wanderings to learn the lesson of who God is and the lesson of who they were not. And their lesson of their great need of the Most High God. I'm sure you've noticed that the fornication that was taking place between thousands in Israel and the daughters of Moab was occurring while they were sitting on the doorstep of their promised land. After 40 years of wandering, the children of Israel were no more than 7 miles away from the River Jordan when all this is taking place. This is the closest the nation had been to the land God had given them. You would think there would have been a renewed fervor in the nation at that point to follow God's directions. They were right on the doorstep of Canaan. And keep in mind, God had told them that the land of Canaan was a good land and a large land, a land flowing with milk and honey. The nation was sitting on the precipice of this promise when this fornication with the daughters of Moab began to take place. Wow. Their close proximity to the land is an important thing to consider in light of God's mention that he was a jealous God and his directive for Israel to destroy everyone they came across that was connected with that fornication. As we've shown, the word jealousy had to do with his protective watch care, and they were sitting on the doorstep of their nation when this took place. And God knew what was in those 5 buckets that he promised in Leviticus 26 that would fall upon the nation should they do these things in their land, and they're doing them at the edge of their land. So you can see why it was so important for God to bring a judgment right then. Not only had he said he would do so, but to do just as he had said and to make it a serious consequence for that behavior. Kill everyone. Now God knew all about those calamitous judgments, and he didn't want that to happen. He knew they would. God knew Israel's history before that history was ever able to play itself out. He knew that every one of the 5 buckets would fall, just as he had predicted they would. So at this point in their history, sitting on the brink of their wilderness education lesson, had they learned anything at all? Obviously not. So God gave them a foretaste, in a sense there, of the calamitous judgment sitting in those buckets of wrath he promised them back in Leviticus. He gave them a foretaste of that wrath before they ever entered the land that God had given them. Israel would be without question, without excuse. What God's doing in these Old Testament books and stories is documenting the history of Israel's failure to live up to the law contract for their righteousness before him. In that way, Israel's failure would serve as an example to all men of all time who dare to assume they can earn a righteous standing before God by way of their performance, that it is a totally impossible thing to do. How much good dwelleth in the flesh, according to the Apostle Paul? Not some inner good that we have to seek out and bring out to the front. No good. As flesh is worthless to God. The only thing this flesh, and the flesh will not produce it, the only thing that's worth anything to God concerning self is what God does through us, and it's the Holy Spirit's fruit, not our fruit. But it's only when we reckon the flesh to be dead, when we reckon the flesh is useless, that God can then use us to produce his fruit through us. God's showing us the condition of fleshly humanity, and it's not a pretty picture here when we look at Israel. The history of Israel's performance simply validates what Paul's going to say to the Gentiles some centuries on down the road while God's program with Israel is on hold. And what did Paul say? Here it is, Romans 3, verse 20. Therefore, by the deeds of the law, there shall how much? No flesh be justified in his sight, for by the law is the knowledge of sin. Israel hadn't learned about her sin. Israel hadn't learned the lesson of their incapacity, the lesson of their flesh. So they hadn't come to realize their need of God to exercise his capacity, the capacity resident in his name, and exercise it on their behalf graciously. But God was making it crystal clear to all future generations who would be reading these accounts of Israel's history that Israel's failure in their wilderness education had not come because God had failed to give that nation ample opportunity to learn their wilderness education lesson and to call upon him to receive them graciously. Now I want you to think back to the pattern we've seen thus far all along in our study. What has that pattern been? God shows us the failure of man. God shows us the capacity resident in all those compound Jehovah names that belong to him. He shows us his grace. He shows us, again, the failure of man. Then he shows us how he takes that huge hypodermic needle out, filled with his grace, his mercy and grace, and he injects a big dose of mercy and grace all over again on behalf of the nation. Why that pattern over and over again? Failure of man, look at my name. Failure of man, look at my grace. It's the same pattern that continues. So can we expect that same pattern to follow now that we've seen the Moabites and the children of Israel intermarrying totally against the contract God laid out for them and their warning he'd clearly given them? What did he allow them to see the consequence of? Their failure. And right after they saw the consequence of their failure, and that failure was brought to a halt, what does he do with that big hypodermic needle of mercy and grace? He takes a bucket of mercy and grace and he pours it out on them all over again. So that pattern is held true, folks. And not only is that pattern held true, they saw the consequence. 24,000 Israelites died at Abel Shittim. But what else happens here? Right after that, God tells Israel about their ability to conquer the nations that they're facing there, those Midianites specifically. He does something else here. We have a few minutes. He gives the names of the two people who were pierced through with that javelin. And he does so for a reason. This is pretty important to see. Numbers 25:14. Now the name of the Israelite that was slain, even that was slain with a Midianitish woman, was Zimri, the son of Salu, the prince of a chief house among the Simeonites. So this was not just an ordinary member of the tribes of Israel. Zimri was a leader, a prince, a ruler of a chief house among the Simeonites. He was an official in the nation Israel. And what begins at the top goes where? They say the people will never rise above the leader of the people. I don't know if that's true, but here we have a leader of Israel. What does that show us? It shows us that God's program with Israel was a national program in scope. It's the leaders of that nation who must understand God's name and learn to call upon that name to receive them graciously. And here we have a leader in the nation who's doing the exact opposite. The name of the Midianitish woman who was slain, Cosbi, the daughter of Zur, he was head over a people and of a chief house in Midian. So it's a national response God's looking for from his nation. He was looking for a national response. He knew that that wouldn't come until these buckets would fall. But would God show mercy and grace and allow Israel to prevail? Look at Numbers 25:16. The Lord spake unto Moses, saying, Vex the Midianites and smite them. That would mean every last one of them, which Israel did not do. What did they do? Oh, they slew the men, but they kept all the women alive, even though those women were the very ones from Moab, the women that would turn the hearts of the men away from the Most High God. So what does Israel leave alive? The women of the nation. Isn't that interesting? Speak unto the children of Israel, and say unto them, when you are passed over Jordan into the land of Canaan, then you shall drive out all the inhabitants of the land before them, and destroy all their pictures, destroy all their molten images, and pluck down all their high places. And ye shall dispossess the inhabitants of the land, and you shall dwell therein, for I have given you the land, Israel, to possess it. What? Right after they had transgressed God's law and saw the consequences, what did God do? He poured out mercy and grace. As we come to the book of Deuteronomy, we see that Moses hands over the mantle, so to speak, the leadership of Israel to Joshua. Moses is going to die before ever seeing the promised land. And Joshua is going to take them into their land in our next study. So let's leave it there for today. Thank God for what we've learned, and I thank God for you folks who've come.